All right. I know we've still got folks joining, but I want to make sure we go ahead and jump in because we've got a lot to cover. I'm Erin Callahan, RMI's Corporate Engagement Director. Thank you for joining our business briefing on RMI's work in the Global South and the current state of workforce development across the Global South. We are really excited to talk with you all today. I do want to have a couple of housekeeping notes at the top before we jump in with our opening remarks. This session is being recorded, so we'll be sure to share a recording with you if you have colleagues who are unable to join today. And we encourage you to use our chat function and the Q&A function that you'll see on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We do want to keep part of this session conversational, so we will be opening it up to audience Q&A a little bit toward the end of the session. So please do drop those in the chat throughout and we'll make sure that they're covered. Appreciate that. So we have a great lineup of speakers today who I'll be introducing in just a few minutes, but you can see here just a real lineup of leaders across our work in the Global South and also Dr. Fletcher, who I'll introduce in just a moment. We'll be covering RMI's work in the Global South. We currently have projects across the islands in the Caribbean, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. So you'll hear about those kind of regions in particular. And we have leaders from those regions represented on the call. So I want to open it up to our opening remarks, and then we'll be moving into a panel discussion after that. But I am really pleased to introduce Dr. James Fletcher. We are incredibly excited to have him here with us today. He's a former Minister for Public Service Information, Broadcasting, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science and Technology in the government of St. Lucia. During his tenure there, he led St. Lucia on an aggressive path toward the modernization of the energy sector, with a strong push toward use of renewables. He's currently the chairman of the executive board of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency and manages his own company, Soloricon. Throughout his career, he's been very active in international climate change negotiations. He played a leading role in the lead up to COP21 and was part of a small select group of ministers from various countries who were selected by the French presidency to help achieve consensus around the more contentious elements of the International Climate Change Treaty. He's one of the reasons we have the climate agreement, the Paris Climate Accords in place. Thank you so much for all your work on that, Dr. Fletcher. And as we get started, Dr. Fletcher, would love to just hear some opening remarks from you, recognizing, as I just mentioned, you played an integral role in the historic Paris Agreement. Could you explain where you see that we are now across the Global South in terms of the energy transition ahead of this year's COP? And a little bit about the role you see for the private sector in achieving those targets.
Thank you, Erin, and thanks everyone. It's good to be here. Thank you, RMI, for putting this on. I guess reflecting back on 2015, the Paris Agreement, and where we are now, we can say that we've made progress, but it's been slow, incremental progress, and nowhere near the pace of what is needed, or even to match the rate at which climate impacts are unfolding right across the globe. Every year since the adoption of the Paris Agreement has ranked among the 10 hottest years we've experienced since we started measuring global temperatures around 1880. We had a significant dip in greenhouse gas emissions in 2020, but that was because of the COVID pandemic and the unprecedented shutdowns in manufacturing and in global travel. But the year after, we went back up to pre-2019 levels. So what we had in 2020 is actually the level of cuts in greenhouse gas emissions that we need to see annually if we are to meet that global goal of net zero by 2050. We've not seen the mobilization of climate finance that was promised. Remember, there was a pledge of $100 billion annually by 2020, from 2020 onwards. The Oxfam Climate Finance Shadow Report of 2023 of this year indicates that developed countries are 3 years overdue on this commitment. And their own reporting shows that they've provided about $83.3 billion, with only 21 to 25 billion of which can be considered as real support. The Oxfam report suggests that the net financial value of the reported climate finance to developing countries, the grant equivalent, may be less than half of what is reported. We're still seeing insufficient funds allocated to adaptation. I think roughly 1/3 of the funds allocated to adaptation, with most of the funding going towards mitigation, which is around 60%. The majority of the climate finance is provided as loans. Only 1/4 of reported public finances in the form of grants. So in effect, SIDS and other developing countries are being asked to borrow money, not always at concessional rates, from the same countries that caused the climate crisis. That's equivalent to them breaking my leg and then saying to me that I now have to borrow money from them to buy a pair of crutches for me to move around on. I mean, that basically is the analogy. It's probably the best analogy I can use. However, these same G20 countries have pumped over $3.3 trillion worth of subsidies into fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement was adopted in December 2015. The gap is growing. The adaptation gap is growing. According to UNEP, that gap is currently, the adaptation cost for developing countries is currently in the range of 160 to $200 billion by 2030. And by the time 2050 comes around, the funding cost for adaptation for developing countries will probably be between 315 to 565 billion US dollars. The projected economic cost of loss and damage is roughly 400 billion US dollars per year, with a projection to reach $1 to $1.8 trillion by 2050. So it means that even the $100 billion annually that has been promised and has been promised for such a long time would be inadequate to meet our current needs for adaptation and for loss and damage. In the meantime, we are now at 1.2 degrees Celsius warming, and based on the 2030 NDC targets and the other binding long-term targets that we've seen, we're on track for warming of between 1.6 and 2.5 degrees Celsius. If we look at the worst case scenario, which is really what is the real world action, what is being done right now, we're probably on track to anywhere between 2.2 and 3.4 degrees Celsius warming. All of these would be catastrophic for small island developing states like mine. So for me, therefore, there are two urgent priorities for COP28, and these are the same priorities that have loomed large at every COP since Paris. The first one is the need for sincere and urgent commitments by the major greenhouse gas emitting countries to drastically reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases to bring us in line with a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. And the second is the mobilization of massive, unprecedented levels of finance that can be made easily accessible by small island developing states and other developing countries so that we may be able to make the necessary interventions that will allow us to respond with immediacy to the very rapidly increasing impacts of climate change. 100 billion US dollars is no longer enough. So COP28 must demonstrate a commitment to a real commensurate response to the existential crisis that's facing SIDS and other small island developing states. I think where the private sector is concerned, they have a very critical role to play. First, they must appreciate that fighting climate change is not just the responsibility of government and civil society. It is a whole of society responsibility that requires a whole of society response, public, private, and civil society. So they must become invested in dealing with the problem. The private sector will be impacted just as much as any other sector in any one of our countries. In fact, they are already being impacted. So we need their advocacy and we need their action. Advocacy in using their platforms and their spheres of influence to change the behavior of their clients, their employees, their stakeholders, and also very importantly, to send a message to governments that climate resilience and sustainability matter to them. And I think equally importantly, their response should consist of individual and collective action to reduce their own carbon footprint and to commit to sustainability. There's some positive signs in that direction with the embrace and adoption of ESG standards that I'm seeing by several private sector institutions. And I'm heartened by the number of times I've been asked during the last year and a half to speak on sustainability and ESG to gatherings of private sector agencies. And this is particularly noticeable within the financial services sector in the Caribbean. But this is not just a Caribbean phenomenon. Increasingly, investors are considering ESG issues in deciding on investment choices. But what we now need to do is to ensure that the environmental component of these ESG plans are consistent with a rapidly decarbonization pathway and a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. The multilateral development banks actually are already doing that. In fact, they've committed to aligning their policies with the goals of the Paris Agreement through 6 agreed building blocks. And I think what we now have to do is to ensure that the environmental standards of the ESG framework that is being adopted by all of these countries are 1.5 degrees Celsius aligned and are Paris aligned. So I think that really is my summary contribution to where we are right now and where we need to be. Thanks, Erin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher. Those fantastic opening remarks around the current state of need ahead of this year's COP negotiations. I want to transition over to Laetitia De Marez, Senior Program Director for the Climate Finance Access Network and Islands Energy Program at RMI. Laetitia has deep experience supporting small island states and least developed countries in the UNFCCC and Green Climate Fund board negotiations. And she has just returned from Bonn as well, where I know she probably has some key takeaways ahead of this year's COP as well. Laetitia, would love to turn it over to you for your perspective on the state of the energy transition and how RMI is thinking about its response.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you, Dr. Fletcher, for setting the scene for us. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Laetitia De Marez, and I'm leading the work here at RMI of the Islands Energy Program, the Climate Finance Access Network. As Dr. Fletcher said, 2023 is really a pivotal year. It's a year where we are taking stock of the progress or lack thereof towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, but also a year where the global community also takes stock of the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And these two global and critical agendas finally align and converge this year. And I say finally because for many of us on this call, I believe, this is nothing new. Especially from private sector and the practitioners, there's dichotomy between development, economic growth, and climate as largely be political or artificial. There is no solution to climate change without social and economic progress, and there should not be a green transition that is unfair and just. So not so long ago, these two agendas were seen as an either-or, and two separate sets of commitments, two separate sets of obligation, but this has changed. And I think this year is very pivotal for this matter. You may have followed the discussions last week in Paris at the summit convened by President Macron for a new financing pact for the people and the planet. As Dr. Fletcher alluded to, the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the Multilateral Development Bank, the IMF, is something that has been in the works for a few years, and it's of course not going to happen overnight. But we saw at this summit convened by President Macron, together with Prime Minister Mia Mottley, that there is high-level political commitments to make it happen. And some practical first steps have been outlined to increase the impact, the efficiency, and the flexibility of these institutions. As Erin mentioned, I also attended the climate conference earlier this month in Bonn, Germany, where all the parties to the Paris Agreement gathered to discuss how to get to an ambitious outcome in Dubai at COP28. In Dubai, in December, the international community, all stakeholders, will need to reset and renew their commitments to the goal of keeping temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius and to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Some initial discussions were very positive and were held in Bonn. For example, there is thinking of setting a global renewable energy target by 2030 to accelerate the energy transition, anywhere between 1 terawatt to 1.5 terawatt renewable energy capacity to be installed by the end of the decade. A lot of stakeholders thinking that setting up a target would focus attention on implementation, would provide a direction of travel to funds, governments, and investors, and send really clear signals to markets, translating the 1.5 temperature goal into a more operational goal. Of course, we don't know yet what is the full extent of the technical findings of the discussions under the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goal, what those stock take exercises will tell us. But what we know is, one, as Dr. Fletcher said, we are not on track to meet our goals. But second, we also know we can get back on track. Roughly, we need to triple the renewable energy capacity and double the energy efficiency worldwide by the end of the decade to get back on the 1.5 degrees pathway. The global north started its transition. It's very clear. We have seen some record numbers of renewable energy installation in Germany, in Europe, this year in 2023. But we also need to accelerate technology and financial transfers to enable the global south to leapfrog ahead. The compounding crisis that we experienced these last few years, the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, were of course devastating for many economies and communities. But the international response demonstrated also that all actors showcase their resilience and their capacity, government, civil society, private sector, to spring into action and implement solutions faster and really at an unprecedented scale. What we've also learned from those crises is how incredibly connected and interdependent we are. Solutions that are not equitable and shared will not deliver. To course correct, we need to go bigger, we need to go faster while leaving no one behind. So focusing now more on what precisely we do at RMI. As I said, we know what is needed to bridge the climate ambition and climate implementation gaps by the end of this decade to get back on track. Based on the science, we need to tackle the decarbonization of energy systems and avoid locking countries into unsustainable energy infrastructure. The IPCC, the science is clear. Scaling decentralized solar and wind energy and energy efficiency are the most powerful tools we have in our toolbox. So now let's talk a bit more about delivering these solutions. At RMI, we also did our stock take in a way. We just came out of a very intense internal strategic discussion involving all the talents and all the knowledge of our organization. We revamped our values and principles and fully align our program, strategies, and operations to deliver maximum impact in what is left of this decisive decade. The Institute is focusing on supporting energy transition across different geographies, in particular in the Global South, where we know the battle of climate change will be won or lost. And within our Global South program, we have adopted our new mantra that is the radical implementation. What we mean by that, and following a proven RMI methods, it translates to working on the ground to identify the pain points in energy ecosystem, energy transition pathways of utilities and governments we work with. And once we have identified those pain points, we tailor solutions to address them in partnership and in consultation with local policymakers, communities, private sector. Across the board, we have identified 2 critical pain points or needs that must be addressed with a matter of urgency to unleash the energy transition and also its social and economic co-benefits in the next few years. First, unlocking and catalyzing finance for the energy transition through developing attractive and bankable pipeline of strategic projects in the Global South. Second, building a workforce that will deliver and carry forward this energy transition. On the first, from RMI's experience working on the ground in different geographies, including islands in the Pacific, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, it all comes down to the projects that we are developing. Due to lack of capacity and expertise, these projects in the Global South often lack ambition, innovation, and quality, and they remain perceived as risky and therefore don't attract investors, delaying the establishment of robust markets and delivering on the social co-benefits such as green jobs. So my colleague will tell you more about RMI's project preparation facilities and the collaborative work with the Climate Finance Access Network, and how we collaborate with impact investors and philanthropies to de-risk those critical investments. Our aim is to get out of the demonstration, or also called the pilot phase of the energy transition. We have learned a lot from those pilot projects, but now we see that countries are struggling to replicate and scale them at the national level or regionally. On the second pain point that we have identified, the energy transition is of course a transition of the workforce, and I think many governments are not ready for it. Estimates are sort of mind-blowing. They show that we need 30 million jobs this decade to meet the 2050 net zero target. So we need to act now to be able to deliver in the future. Clean energy technologies alone will create 14 million jobs by the end of this decade and another 16 million in other areas of the green economy. Therefore, training, reskilling, upskilling workers is an urgent challenge for policymakers, for businesses, and for education systems around the world, but in particular for those countries that have capacity constraints and of course poorer countries. And this is precisely why RMI created the Energy Transition Academy, or ETA, as an initiative to support and accelerate the transition of the workforce while maximizing social and gender benefits and empowering new energy leaders. I want to conclude by saying that at RMI, our key value is applied hope. And while there are many reasons to despair this year, impacts of climate change, temperature rising, we are determined to shift that perception and to highlight those positive tipping points that we believe are within our grasp. So I will now hand it back over to Erin and to my colleagues who will tell you a lot more about those solutions and actions we are pursuing across our various programs.
Thank you so much, Laetitia, for that fantastic kind of context setting on the state of play across the globe and what to expect ahead of this year's COP. I do want to note for those on the call that we are going to have a fuller COP28 briefing call later this year. I know a lot of companies have reached out asking what RMI's plans are and you know, what we'll be doing and how to think about showing up this year. So please do expect that. But with no further ado, I want to bring on our panel. We're lucky to have Dr. Fletcher joining us for the panel again. And then Laetitia needs to drop. So Laetitia, thank you again for that. We appreciate your participation. And I want to introduce two other leaders that we have from RMI. We have David Gumbs, Principal for the Islands Energy Program at RMI. He's provided business advisory and renewable energy solutions to clients across the US, Africa, and the Caribbean. And he's the former Chief Executive Officer of the Anguilla Electricity Company, where he successfully implemented renewable energy technologies, achieving one of the region's highest penetration levels. We also have Raul Alfaro-Pelico, who oversees RMI's Africa Energy Program, which enables energy access and de-risk clean energy projects across the region, and the Energy Transition Academy, which Laetitia just covered and we'll hear more about. So thank you all for joining us. I'd love to start by just kind of transitioning from that big picture into what's actually happening on the ground and the programs and projects that you oversee and what you view as the kind of current state of play in your regions. And David, would love to start with you if that's okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Erin. It's such a pleasure to be here today and share a little more context about the work we do in the region. As Erin described, we work with Caribbean islands to help them through the transition process. And we do that in a couple of ways. We essentially look for intervention opportunities in each country, and we help them overcome the barriers. And a couple of key things that come to mind. Finance, access to finance. It's a significant challenge. We know climate change is impacting the Caribbean more so than many other countries because of the small nature, low-lying states, islands that are very vulnerable to climate change, and the frequent occurrence of storms throughout the year. So we are just at the beginning of the hurricane season, and already I think we're at Hurricane Brett just the other day, a tropical storm Brett. And so that means this was supposed to be a low frequency year, and it's turned out to be a very active year already. So that has a tremendous implication for the Caribbean islands. One, they have a significant gap in terms of their ability to meet the financial needs to make the renewable energy transition happen. That means that each storm that hits a Dominica, Anguilla, or Puerto Rico and devastates their economy to the tune of 2 times their GDP, they have a 10-year period to recover from that. Usually that means taking out more loans to rebuild and, to rebuild and recover from the storm. That alone, that experience alone sets them back so many years in terms of their development and their access and ability to make this transition happen. So we come in and intervene in a couple of ways. And this is transition, as Laetitia laid out, over the last few years. So we've gone from pilot projects to more of a portfolio approach and aggregating projects. And by doing so, we will be able to do a couple of things. We've launched the Caribbean Climate Smart Fund, which is a fund that has 2 parts. The investment part, which will invest in projects once they're brought to bankability, and the project preparation part, which brings projects through the pipeline to bankability. So what we are facing currently in the region is that one of the primary barriers, access to finance. that will solve a host of other challenges that the region also faces. But we do know finance can solve a significant amount of problems. With finance, we can get at the issues of climate change in itself, with mitigation and adaptation. And then we can get at capacity building, creating jobs through the transition, and building the capacity to fill those jobs. And also just the sheer economic development that renewable energy brings, and access to technologies and a host of other things. So we'll dig in a little more as we go through the conversation, but hopefully that gives you a good perspective as to where we are.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, David. And I definitely want to dig more into the Caribbean Climate Smart Fund and the project preparation part of what you guys are doing. But Raul, would love to hear how this applies to the work that you're doing with RMI's Africa program and what the state of play is there right now.
Thank you so much, Erin, and it's a pleasure to be in this discussion. I think the scene has been set already. If we deep dive in the African continent, we notice that, in fact, in order to meet our net zero targets by 2050, we need to create 4 million jobs by 2030. And that is a significant undertaking, and that's the reason why RMI created the Energy Transition Academy. The reality is that that might sound like a challenge, and it is in the sense that no one single investment has been made globally to really develop the workforce in such a significant scale. However, we do have the opportunity to do so because across the continent, we see several countries, despite the very low footprint in terms of emissions, as Dr. Fletcher alluded in relation to small island development states, you do have least developed countries and developing countries across Africa that have also a very minimal footprint. Despite that, they are setting and embarking on what they call just energy transition plans. Right? All of those not only actually show the commitment of the global south, and particularly Africa, to really decarbonize and mitigate climate change, but also actually embedded in that commitment, there is a significant need to invest in human capital. As an example, I've been in Nigeria a couple of times this year, where we have rolled out quite a number of offerings from the Energy Transition Academy. Nigeria alone has to actually produce up to 1 million jobs in order to transition to net zero, in order to realize its energy transition plan. Half of those jobs are in the power sector. One of the key challenges that we see coming up to the next COP is that discussion around fossil fuels and investment into fossil fuels. But the truth is, if Nigeria was able to access to the finance that both Dr. Fletcher and David have alluded to, in fact, instead of talking about jobs lost in the gas sector or in the oil and gas sector, we will be talking about at least 400,000 jobs created in the clean energy. And I think this is why it's very important that we, attract capital, but also when we talk about capital, we don't just think about financial capital, but we also talk about human capital. And that's why it's very important to think about workforce development. Let me pause here.
Thank you so much, Raul. That's really great to hear. And would love to hear, I know we've gotten a kind of general framing about some of the challenges to both workforce development and unlocking finance across the global south when we're trying to accelerate the energy transition. Could you talk through, in the geographies that you lead, kind of some of the challenges that you're seeing to this kind of idea of radical implementation and some of the innovative mechanisms that you see kind of working to get around some of those challenges? And Dr. Fletcher, I might start with you here if you have some thoughts on kind of the challenges that you're seeing in St. Lucia.
Well, I think the challenges are very similar to what has already been said. The question of human resource capacity is a big one. In fact, it's one of the reasons we actually, the government of St. Lucia, has this relationship with RMI. When I became Minister of Responsibility for Energy in 2011, 2012, one of the first things I found was that we just did not have any capacity within a new ministry with responsibility for energy to deal with the multiplicity of issues and also investors that were coming at us fast and furious. We just didn't have that in-house capacity. So, we looked at who was there to provide us with support, and there was a Clinton Climate Initiative. There was what used to be the Carbon War Room, and then RMI. And I mean, if it weren't for those institutions, for those agencies, we would have signed on to some very dubious agreements, as many countries did, and found ourselves locked into things that just couldn't work. So I think dealing with the the insufficiency of human resource capacity is a big one, and I'm really happy about the academy that RMI has set up. And that also comes with its own challenges in developing projects, project preparation, so that you can access funding. Very often I hear our prime ministers lament the fact that we are not getting funding from the GCF and the Adaptation Fund and others. But then there's another side to that coin, in that we're not flooding the GCF and the Adaptation Fund and the GEF with a whole bunch of projects that really reflect the urgency of the situation and how much climate change is impacting every single sector. When you look at the impact that climate change is having on small island developing states, least developed countries in Africa, everywhere else, every single one of these countries should have at least 50 projects in front of the GCF right now, because every sector is being impacted. But because we don't have that capacity, or we don't have sufficient capacity to develop these projects, particularly with the kind of rigid empirical data and analysis that the GCF calls for, then that puts us at a disadvantage. So I really would like to see us beef up our project preparation capacity so that we can really flood those agencies, those funding agencies, with projects to show that, look, the onus is on you now to help us, because by the time we get the money, the problem that we're trying to solve has multiplied 3 or 4 times. I think at our domestic end too, we have to do some things that we've been a little reluctant to do. One of them is deal with the legislative and regulatory environment. We've allowed this to drag for too long. In most of our countries, we still are operating on a very unprogressive legislative frameworks, electricity supply acts that give monopoly status to incumbent utilities, that don't allow for independent power producers to come in, that don't create a level playing field so that an independent power producer is coming in and will get access to the same incentives that the incumbent utility has. So I think that has to be resolved. And also that regulatory framework that will allow goal setting to not be in the hands of the utility, which it is right now. So in many instances, energy planning is done by the utilities, not done by the government, and it's certainly not done as it should be by an independent regulator who will say, okay, there should be growth of, let's say, 5% per year in demand for energy in a particular country. That should be filled by a mixture of wind, solar, and this is what the agreement should look like. So that has to take place in order to give the investors the comfort and the security that they can move into markets as small as ours and be able to compete with incumbent utilities. So I think for me, it's 3 things. It's the capacity, it's the access to the finance, but it's also us putting in place that enabling framework, that enabling legislative and regulatory framework that will allow that energy transition to take place.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Fletcher. And I want to especially pull out what you said around project preparation. And I know that's something that Laetitia touched on in her intro. And David, would love to hear a little bit about what that's looking like and how we're working with partners to de-risk projects and work to stand up project preparation facilities. Could you speak to a little bit of our work in that space?
Certainly. The project preparation is critical. What we've been facing for many, many years, it was a chicken and egg scenario. You'll hear, we don't have enough projects, so therefore that's why we don't invest in the region. And then you'll hear, well, we don't have projects because no one has invested in the region. And it's actually pretty straightforward. If the finance was available to do the things, the enabling things that allow the local markets to flourish and capitalize on those opportunities and spur the economic development that's needed. And I'll put it this way. Energy is such a critical factor in the region where for the average household, it can account for 30+% of their annual spend. So that tells you how much capital is tied up just in burning fossil fuel. All right. We know we can do it cheaper. We know we can do it more resiliently to withstand the hurricanes that are getting worse and worse. So what we know has to happen, there has to be a upscaling, a significant radical approach to getting projects through the pipeline. And that means that if the investors are wary, we need to get them some level of comfort by getting a whole host of projects through that bankability pipeline. And that means we need to invest in project preparation. And we know we need finance to make that happen, okay? And the reason why I said finance is the key is because if you get the finance to make that happen, you invest in the projects. The people that will be working on the projects, the local folks, islanders such as myself and others working on the projects, that helps to enhance and build capacity. So the Islands program, we work closely with the Energy Transition Academy that Raul was speaking to, and we work with utilities, we work with developers, we work with regulators, and we try to build that capacity through the project development process. Now, when we say project development and sort of de-risking these projects and making them bankable, we're talking about from A to Z up to the point of the project going out for procurement. So lots of times we have to do the technical financial analyses that demonstrate to investors that these projects are financially viable. And in most cases they are. And guess why? Caribbean energy prices are an average 3 to 4 times higher than the average price in the US. So when when you look at a particular city, Washington, D.C., where they pay roughly 15 cents per kilowatt hour, in some Caribbean countries, they're still today, even with the decline in fuel prices since the Russia-Ukraine crisis, are paying upwards of 50 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour. That's a significant burden. And if we could basically invest in the project preparation, creating jobs through the process, creating the skill sets that are needed to do this on a larger scale through the project preparation, we can then solve a magnitude of problems, a litany of problems throughout that cycle. We're building jobs. Those jobs create more investment, creates more economic development locally, reduces costs for investors. In the Caribbean, the hotel industry is a significant investor or job creator in the region. But they're wary to invest because the number 2 cost and sometimes number 1 cost for these entities is energy. So if we can lower that, we attract more investment, we create more jobs, and the cycle continues, right? So now we have economic development. Well, investors now feel more comfortable because we have a strong economy, a larger chance that they will get the return on an investment, get paid because the utilities have a lower cost, and everyone, it's a win-win situation for everyone. And that's why, because we can get caught up in, where's the problem, who's the problem? But bottom line is, if we could solve that finance problem at the front end, we solve a whole series of problems on the back, including opportunities for investors to come into the region and make a reasonable return on investment.
Thank you so much, David. And I want to pivot over to how this picture looks in Africa. But before I do that, David, would just love to ask one follow-up to just kind of tease out, you referenced the Caribbean Climate Smart Fund in your opening remarks. Would love to just hear kind of how that fits more specifically into the picture that you just laid out for us.
Yeah, happy to. And that's after 8 years of working in the region, that's what we see. After working with governments, utilities, and folks on the ground, we got a clear understanding of the need. And that's where the Caribbean Climate Smart Fund came into play. And essentially, the Caribbean Climate Smart Fund has 2 parts. One, the project preparation facility, which creates projects, create a pipeline of projects for investors and local and foreign, but investors now have the opportunity to invest in projects. It also creates that pipeline of investment funds, of capital that is ready and available to invest in projects. So we no longer have this chicken or egg scenario. We have both solutions. And what we hope to achieve by doing this is to basically create that economic engine that stirs up the pot. So rather than a pilot project and everyone sits back and say, okay, well, that was successful because it was small, but that was successful because of X or Y. No, now we have a whole portfolio of projects across the region, building confidence and building that sort of economic incentive to build and sort of expand and grow that I mentioned earlier. When we catalyze that segment of the market, it creates more projects create more opportunity, more confidence, and so on. And it keeps going, and it just builds upon itself.
Thank you so much, David. And I also want to thank those of you in the audience for sending in questions. We are going to be getting to those in just a few minutes. But Raul, would love to pivot over to you and hear kind of what the state of play is in Africa around this, recognizing that there is also a good amount of pilot project fatigue there, and what you're seeing and how that's leading RMI to structure and finance projects.
Thank you, Erin. I mean, the first issue here when we're talking about Africa is the scale of the investment that we need to undertake. And because, and that's where the challenge with just doing pilots here and there doesn't really solve the problem. Let's start with the fundamental issue. You have 600 million Africans without access to electricity. The majority of the African population is actually in the rural areas. In these rural areas, the majority of the economic activity is dominated by agriculture, which is also the major employer in the region. Now, guess what? With some of the work that we are doing on the ground, which initially is piloted, but then scaled up, we are able to not just introduce productive use of electricity options in rural areas, but in the process, revitalize economic activity in a way that it involves local population. That's one of the big wins of investing in renewable energy, that you actually empower local populations. You actually make sure that the economy is not so dependent on international dynamics. David alluded to the Ukrainian, the war in Ukraine. And then most importantly, which I think that's the main area for me and for the Energy Transition Academy, you're actually empowering the youth as well as women. I think this is one aspect that oftentimes is not touched on. I mean, we hear about the just transition, we hear about green jobs, but we don't really hear so much about, in fact, where we see, the opportunities. And in particular, when we talk about women, we see that at least right now, women are participating in the energy workforce, in the clean energy workforce, 30%, at the 30% level. When you think about fossil fuels, that percentage drops to 20%. And in fact, when you think about clean energy, and if you invest and you attract the capital that David was talking about, then you have this ability to bring that workforce participation to parity. And so, in fact, clean energy provides a significant opportunity to involve women in the workforce, and in fact, equip those women both in the rural area as well as in the urban areas with the skill sets to not just take on admin roles, but also take technical roles as well as leadership roles. And an example of an initiative that we are leading and we piloted in the Caribbean and now is scaled globally is the Women in Renewable Energy Network, where in fact we are working with women, giving them the confidence to, walk into the very male-oriented world of energy. That's one area. I think the second area that I think is important is the involvement of the youth. I just came from Nairobi, and I think there was an Africa Energy Forum there, as well as a Youth Energy Summit. It turns out that Africa's population, 70% of it is under the age of 30. And in fact, as we think about the global south, both Africa and Asia will be housing the majority of the youth population. That's where we need to invest the capital. And it turns out that becomes also the biggest employer. And what is missing is that investment in human capital that I was just alluding to. And initiatives such as our Global Fellowship Program is actually addressing that challenge head on, because we're working with early career professionals, both in the utility, energy utilities, but also in regulators, in government, also in investor companies, developers, also working with financiers to ensure that there's a clear understanding of what it takes to transition to net zero by equipping individuals as well as institutions in different sectors. So this is not just an electricity sector issue. We need financiers like some of you on the call involved. We also need people on the business space. We need people on civil society. All these individuals need to be equipped with the know-how. One of the key focuses of the Energy Transition Academy is practical application of knowledge. This is not a theoretical play, because that's the only way you can actually move the needle when it comes to investment. Back to you, Erin.
Thank you so much, Raul. And building on what you talked about, kind of around some of the co-benefits to the energy transition work that we're doing in Africa, Dr. Fletcher, would love to pivot over to you. I know this has been a real focus of your work and experience in the Caribbean energy space. Can you talk through the other benefits that you're seeing and that are kind of necessarily a part of the energy transition work that you've been leading as well, beyond just the energy system, on gender equity, resilience, and other indicators?
Yeah, I think there are so many co-benefits, and the biggest one, as David pointed out, is the high cost of energy. When you bring that cost of energy down in every single Caribbean country, except maybe Trinidad and Tobago, which is a producer of fossil fuel, you make every single economic sector more competitive. The tourism industry, which is such a big one for us, you make it more competitive. You increase the possibility of value added in the agricultural sector, which is a big issue for us, particularly when we look at food security. So you make your economy more robust, you make your economy more stable, and you create opportunities for expansion of that economy. We're all reeling with this post-COVID recovery. COVID really did a number on the Caribbean economically, and I think the green economy, and particularly green energy, gives us an opportunity to really cause that transformation to take place. What I'm not happy about is the urgency that I'm seeing within the Caribbean to make this happen. I think because our leaders are still so preoccupied with the things that they've always had to deal with. So high debt to GDP ratios and limited fiscal space to operate within, and issues of education and health. They have not really fully understood just how transformational the energy sector is to every single element of their socioeconomic development. But even still, we are seeing a great amount of interest. But I think what is necessary is for us to cause that energy transition to look less and less like a technical issue and more like a social imperative. But I think maybe that's the failure that we have. I've seen it in many instances in the beginning with our climate change discussions, that they were too technical, that people were not understanding. And it was when you were able to get other people outside of the technical people to explain to people the dangers that climate change pose and what we needed to do. That's when we brought other people on board. And I think very often we underestimate the importance of information and packaging information so that people understand the benefits to them, and also to make those benefits expand. Because going back to my experience as a minister, for example, one of the challenges I always had was to get the average person, particularly the vulnerable populations, to see any benefit in this energy transition. Because the people who you would think would immediately benefit from the energy transition would be the people like me who can afford to put solar PV panels on their roof, who have roofs that can accommodate a solar PV panel, who can afford to buy energy efficient appliances. But the average person can't afford any of these things. So how do you make that energy transition work for them? And I think that's what we have to do. How does government now intervene and say, okay, you know what? By simple things, by saying that on all public buildings in a particular space or adjacent to a particular community that we know is impoverished, we will ensure that whatever credits are created from the generation of renewable energy from those buildings go towards offsetting the cost of electricity for everybody living in that area. So they now see, okay, as a result of these solar panels that are on this library or on this police station or on this school, then my energy bill is zero. So this energy thing makes sense. I'm really invested in this. I want to see this work. But that connection is not there. So that's why I think, we need to look at innovative ways of ensuring that everybody benefits from this, and not just the hoteliers who see an opportunity to bring down their energy bill by 50% by putting in massive solar PV installations on their roof. And yes, it would make sense for them, but think of the poor person whose energy bill probably is now 30% of his or her monthly income. Can you imagine the impact on that person if you're able to zero their energy bill, and how you could cause this whole energy transition to go to a whole different level? So I think that's what we now need to start seeing. When governments talk about social safety nets and poverty alleviation interventions, they need to see energy and putting in RE in a particular community as a social intervention, as a poverty alleviation intervention, because you're now saying to a household that for the rest of your life, you will never have to worry about paying an electricity bill again. So the $30, $50 that you're paying for electricity, you can now put that to something else. That is a powerful statement to make. And I think so those are the things that we can do to ensure that everybody, if we're really talking equity, to ensure that everybody is part of this energy revolution.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher, for that. And Raul, what is the role of business in making this happen? And how does RMI think about bringing businesses in to activate and accelerate these transitions?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, business is there to scale successful business model. We've talked about, portfolios and moving away from pilots. The reality is that you still need to test some business models before the private sector can come in. So I think this is where RMI is playing a key role with its partners. So for instance, in Africa, the Africa Ministries Program is a technical assistance facility that is helping roll out mini-grid business models across 21 countries in the region. These 21 countries represent 400 million people that do not have access to electricity. From the perspective of that challenge, I see a significant opportunity for the private sector because 400 million people is a scale, a significant scale. So I think that's one entry point. And some of the work that the African Mini-Grids program does is work with governments to introduce the policies and regulations that will pave the ground for private sector participation. It's also testing certain business models because there are cases like in Nigeria where you actually have very good regulation, but some of the business models are not yet fully tested. And by business models, I mean working with developers, working with off-taker communities, as well as with utilities to try to see what's the best way to actually bring in cheap, clean energy to the population. And then finally, there is a significant role for the private sector. And by private sector, I mean also the financial sector, insurance companies, as well as other financial institutions to really test different financial mechanisms that are actually critical to be able to scale those interventions. So I would say that those are the three elements that I see critical in Africa.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that. And I want to move over to some Q&As we've gotten in the chat to make sure we have time to address them. One set of questions we got from the audience is around, can you speak more about what utilities see as barriers to investing in renewable infrastructure other than just not wanting to do it? And we got a follow-up asking, can you speak more about who has the ability to enforce policies and regulations needed to ensure applying for capital is more accessible? And David, I thought you might have a starting answer for us on that.
Yeah, certainly. I think from the utility perspective, as the former CEO of a utility, we were wary of renewable energy in the transition and what that meant for various institutions. But I think the utility space has moved from that, and it's happened over the last 5 years or so. Two things have happened. The cost has gone down like dramatically, to the tune of about 80% from solar panel costs from like 2010 to today. And battery storage has gone down over 50%. So it's no longer a cost issue, which was a big concern for utilities, but it's also, we're seeing that we need to make this happen because of the day-to-day experience and frequent storms and the damage that it takes. So we need to become more resilient. We need to be more distributed, and there's a significant cost benefit to doing so. So from a utilities perspective, I think the utilities want to make this happen. There's still a debate how much should be distributed versus utility owned, but that's a debate that I think is going to go away because there's so much space for everyone to play in this today. So from a utility standpoint, they are facing the same challenges that we laid out. They're technically sound. They have the engineers, but those engineers are focused on the day-to-day, just keeping the lights on. There's a bigger problem that is happening right now, and it'll be even bigger in 5 years. And that is, there's a standstill of new fossil fuel investments in the region because each government, each utility is making that conscious decision. I don't want to continue down this path. I want to go towards a renewable energy future. The problem is they don't have the wherewithal to make it happen. And there's the wherewithal to make it happen. And then there is, in some cases, where you may have private utilities or you may have a different regulatory environment. Some utilities are saying, you know what? If I'm going to make this 25, 30-year investment today, which is a significant cost, my license expires in 2 years from now. I need some level of certainty that I can have my return on investment over that course of time. So there's some real practical decisions that has to be made. But for the most part, 90% of the time, the utilities want to make this happen. They're eager to work with us. The challenge is between us and others in this space, we don't have the capacity, the financial wherewithal to support them, nor do they have the financial wherewithal to do it on their own.
Thank you so much for that, David.
There was a quick question on the finance side. I think that varies from market to market, but the challenge with finance is just it's not available. So accessing the limited amounts that are there, it's a tall order. So from the private institutions, the banks, they don't invest and take this risk. So between that and the sort of global funders that are participating in the development banks that are participating in the region, it takes too long. So there's a lot of frustration, and it almost makes access impossible. So the goal for the Caribbean Caribbean Climate Smart Fund is essentially to raise $150 million for investment and $15 million for bankability, for making projects bankability. I think in the investment side of things, we're talking about a 3-month window to invest in projects. So it will curtail a lot of the challenges that you face in that sector. It's just more nimble and more flexible.
Thank you so much, David. Really, really appreciate you touching on both of those questions. And I know we've just got a couple minutes left. I'd love to ask in closing, just for companies on the line, if there's one thing that you want them to take away from this, what should that be? And Dr. Fletcher, I might start with you for that.
That there are significant opportunities in the energy sector. The cost and these opportunities will remain because the cost of energy in our region, as David pointed out, is so very high that any project in the Caribbean would make sense. That there's also a very strong appetite within our space for us to move in that direction, not so much from a climate change mitigation point of view, because we are not major contributors to global greenhouse gases, but because we want to play that role on the international stage to show that we are doing something. We understand the urgency of this existential climate crisis that we're experiencing. So we want to play our part to show that if we can do this, then the Russias, the Chinas, the United States and the European Unions, you need to do your bit to get us in line with 1.5. So there is an opportunity, and let's work together to make it happen. Government, I think, has a role to play, has a very important role to play, because government needs to send the signals to the utility companies to address many of the concerns that David pointed out. And I think that's important. And we need energy champions within our spaces, and not just energy champions in government, but energy champions in the private sector, energy champions within civil society, so that everybody can understand that this is a big opportunity that's available to us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher. I think that's a great note to close on. We've got less than a minute left here. So I just want to take some time to thank you for joining us. We are so lucky to have your wisdom and insights today. And thank you so much to Raul and to David for joining us. This has been a fantastic discussion. I really appreciate it. And to everyone in the audience, thank you guys so much for coming with fantastic questions. We really appreciate your being here. Please get in touch with us. You can email us at corporate@rmi.org. We would love to have a follow-up conversation with you about any of this. We will share the recording with you as a follow-up, so please expect to see that in your inbox. And otherwise, I hope you have a fabulous week and a wonderful rest of your day. Really appreciate it. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.